bursting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, into your town, into your home, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophony of conversation, filling in tonight for my friend and colleague George Norrie, and glad to be back with you once again. It's Friday night, of course, beginning of the weekend, Memorial Day weekend to boot, which means many of you can stay up late with us tonight. You have no excuse. Don't have to get up to go to work in the morning. We'll have a couple of hours of open lines, this being Friday and all, and we can talk about whatever is on your mind. And as always, we'll be asking all of you to bring your A game tonight. Give us your good stuff. Show doesn't work without you, so put on a pot of joe, pull up a seat around the campfire, and let's jump right into the middle of these coast-to-coast subjects that you don't really get to hear about anywhere else, not like here anyway. Special greetings tonight to all of our listeners in Oklahoma. We all know about the terrible events of the past week. Unbelievable devastation. Nature's fury unleashed. Hope you're hunkered down somewhere safe and warm and dry tonight if you are listening to us from that great state. I will be sharing with you some news items that should be of interest to our listeners, stuff that Webmaster Sean and I have culled from various places over the past couple of days. That'll wait a little bit later in the program. In this hour, I thought we could start off with sort of a post-mortem on perhaps the highest profile UFO event of the past several years. 5 days of testimony from 40 witnesses who hail from 10 countries, 30 hours of statements to and questions from a panel of 6 former members of Congress. The disclosure event in Washington at the National Press Club got a lot of media attention, and predictably a lot of it was pretty snarky, at least in the beginning, but there was fair and solid coverage as well, and the testimony, I think in all fairness, had an effect on these former lawmakers, some of whom, at least from the media articles I read, some of whom sounded pretty surprised at the quality of the information that they were given and the credentials of some of these witnesses. But there, of course, has been criticism from within the UFO community, where else, asking, what was the point of all this? Shouldn't there have been better vetting of the witnesses? We will put those questions to the man who did the heavy lifting to put this event together, Stephen Bassett, who will join me in a moment to figure out what worked well and what could have been better. Does this move us closer to some sort of formal disclosure? Was it worth the cost and the effort? We have Stephen for this hour, so I'm not going to use up more of his allotted time. Let's take our first break and come right back with Stephen Bassett. I'm George Knapp, in tonight for George Norrie, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Knapp, in tonight for George Norrie, who has the night off. Stephen Bassett is a political activist, lobbyist, and commentator. He's been a guest on this program several times before. He is the executive director of the Paradigm Research Group and a leading advocate for what he says is ending the government-imposed truth embargo regarding extraterrestrial presence and the human race. He's the guy who, as I mentioned, did the heavy lifting for the citizen hearing on disclosure. Stephen, great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be with you, George.
If you are there, I'm not hearing you.
Uh-oh. Not hearing me? Not good.
Stephen, I'm not hearing you, so I'm just going to go ahead and open up with a general question and hope that I'll be able to hear you in a moment. I want you to start with sort of what was the point of the hearing? I know you had, I think, 6 general goals. What was the point? How close do you think you got to those goals? Give me your general postmortem on what happened.
George, can you hear me now? Oh, Jesus. What could be the problem?
I am here, but I can't hear you, Stephen. So just go ahead and share with us. I haven't heard any interviews after the event, so share with us what you set out to do and how you think it worked.
Well, George, I'm not sure if your audience is hearing me. We've used this phone before, and it's worked fine. So if you're not hearing me, I don't even know if I'm coming across on your show. Can you? So I'm a little confused, my friend. Hang on.
I'll tell you what, just if he is talking, just convey to me when he stops, and I'll ask him something. Hello, Stephen. I don't know. Are we able to hear Stephen at all? We're not? today. This is sort of a breaking news. This was a release, comes out of Jackson, Mississippi, May 24, 2013. It was put out by a law firm in that city, and I don't think even Stephen Bassett has heard this quite yet. Patrick Franscona, Esquire, put this out for immediate release. I'll share it with you the first time anybody's hearing it. 6 former members of Congress have signed a letter to President Obama expressing concern over the lack of response by the Veterans Administration to requests for medical records pertinent to the medical treatment of 2 career U.S. Air Force veterans who suffer from medical disability stemming from contact with an object of unknown origin while on duty as base security at the U.S. Air Base at RAF Bentwaters in December 1980. If you saw any of the citizen disclosure hearing, any of the proceedings from Washington, you know that some of the most dramatic testimony came from these 2 guys, retired tech sergeants John Burroughs and James Peniston, who claim that the government is denying them proper treatment for injuries they sustained in the line of duty at this base security at Bentwaters, December 1980. Peniston and Burroughs were the first on-scene responders to a potential base incursion by an object of unknown origin into one of the most sensitive U.S. Air Force installations at the height of the Cold War. And as such, the pair were momentarily on the front lines of the U.S. Air Force defense establishment in Europe. The most perplexing aspect of this case is the apparent classified status of the records in question by the VA. This was sort of a major point that was raised at the hearings. These guys want to know what they were exposed to. The pair testified before the former members of Congress at the citizens' hearing on disclosure. The former congresspersons include former Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska, former House of Representatives members Merrill Cook of Utah, Roscoe Bartlett of Maryland, Darlene Hooley of Oregon, Carolyn Kirkpatrick of Michigan, and Lynn Woolsey of California. This letter, a copy of which was sent to both President Obama and the head of the VA, said in part, as former members of Congress, we're writing to express concern over the lack of response by our government to 2 of our retired servicemen who dutifully served our country during the Cold War. The letter went on to state the denial of access to these records and requesting presidential assistance in obtaining them. To this day, of course, there's been no real public explanation of the events surrounding their exposure to the phenomena. If you're familiar with the Bentwaters case at all, you know that there's been a great deal of difficulty in getting a straight story. For a long time, the military wouldn't say anything, and then they released all sorts of bogus sorts of explanations about what might have been seen in the forests outside of the base there on a couple of evenings. They tried to explain it away as a lighthouse, light from a lighthouse, and other pretty weak explanations that really didn't fit. The guys who were there, Burroughs and Peniston included, walked in the forest. They saw this thing darting around in between the trees. I think a couple of them even touched it. They claim that formerly classified documents confirm that the Air Force has been aware of these dangers presented to the airmen, but failed to properly brief them for their mission. Both Burroughs and Peniston have experienced medical issues in the years since their encounter at Rendlesham Forest. The VA has utterly denied benefits to the pair and further obfuscated any release of medical records on this incident without reason. Burroughs said, we've been stonewalled. None of the avenues have led to proper support of our post-incident medical issues, nor to any viable explanation of why information useful to the treatment of our condition is being withheld. Almost 2 years of utterly futile attempts to obtain Burroughs and Peniston's service medical records from the government, in addition to a failed attempt by former Arizona Senator John Kyle, it's becoming ever more apparent that someone somewhere does not want them released, said the attorney, the counsel for Burroughs and Peniston, the guy whose office put out this release. Burroughs said, we don't intend to be the last 2 casualties of the Cold War left hung out to dry by our chain of command and obsolete notions of national security. There is no reason at this late date to deny us the information that may extend our lives, the bulk of which we spent in service to our country. I think that was some of the most dramatic testimony I heard. I didn't get to hear all 30 or 40 hours of the testimony at the hearing, but that was some of the most dramatic stuff. I would point out, I hope we get Stephen Bassett on here to talk about this, but some of the other highlights, at least for me, were the testimony of foreign witnesses. They had a scientist from China who sort of outlined the interest in UFOs and ETs in his country. We think we've got a lot of interest here. In China, I mean, you have UFO groups that have members in the millions. He said that he testified that the material that has been studied by Chinese scientists is taken pretty seriously and presumably also taken seriously by their government. The other, I think, highlighted the testimony as far as I was concerned was the guys who talked about these intrusions at nuclear bases. In addition to the two guys at Bentwaters, there was testimony about guys who were on the northern perimeter bases. If you've ever heard about those incursions, Robert Hastings has written about them. Hastings was invited but did not attend the event. But some of his key witnesses who were there when these things flew over the bases, interfered with launch control codes, things of that sort, were chased and disappeared. They testified, and some of their testimony was pretty powerful as well. One witness that really jumped out at me, and I spoke about this last weekend, I was at this UFO event in McMinnville, Oregon, was this guy, Colonel French. And here was a guy who worked for Project Blue Book. It was essentially his job to explain away UFO cases, and he admitted it. He would travel around the world, around the country. He would interview witnesses who say they had seen UFOs, and then he would come up with some sort of a way to explain these things away. However, he had never before revealed this story that he had his own UFO incident, and he testified in front of this member of 6 former members of Congress and told about this encounter. He saw this UFO that went into the water, and he saw these 2 alien-looking occupants who got out of the craft underwater and were trying to effect what looked to him like repairs on the craft. Of course, he went back to his superiors, told them what he had seen, and then they put a file in the report, the official Blue Book files, which sort of explained the whole thing away and downplayed it significantly. He had interviewed witnesses. There were dozens of people there who saw the same thing he did, but of course the whole thing was sort of brushed under the rug. This is sort of suspicions confirmed, I think. A lot of the things that we have thought about Project Blue Book over the years, that it was a whitewash, that it wasn't really a scientific study at all, that it was basically a public relations effort designed to get rid of the UFO issue, make people not take it very seriously, to make fun of UFO witnesses, come up with explanations like swamp gas for various UFO sightings. This guy who worked for Project Blue Book confirmed it. That's a pretty important testimony. Of course, the other testimony came that really caught people's attention and got a lot of media coverage is from a mystery man. We'll call him Anonymous. He appeared only on videotape. I don't know if you've seen this videotape, but it's pretty amazing. The guy claims to have worked first as an Army cryptographer, then went to work for the CIA, said he was sent out to Area 51, that he remembers the same sort of facility south of Area 51 at Papoose Lake that was described in 1989 by Bob Lazar. Says he saw these different hangars built into the side of the mountain, that they had craft in there, that there were significant differences between the military and the CIA about what should be done with this material, how it should be handled. He claimed at one point that President Eisenhower had been briefed about it and that Eisenhower had threatened to send in the Army to take over the base. Now, a lot of people have come up with different problems that they have with this guy's testimony. We don't yet know what his true identity is. What we were told was this was a deathbed confession on his part, that he was going to be dying in a couple of months. He's got serious health issues, that he has no reason to lie. And so he told this incredible story. I think 17 or so minutes of this were shared with the panel and the audience there at the disclosure hearing, and it was sort of stunning testimony. Now, what weight do you give something like that? I don't really know, because we don't yet know who the guy is, whether he can verify his credentials. The interview was done in a hotel room in, I think, a northern state. And Richard Dolan, historian, a very credible guy who's been on this show many times, is the one who asked the questions. A friend of mine, a guy I know, a filmmaker named Jeremy Corbell, is the guy who was behind the camera, recorded this stuff. If we get a chance, I'm going to call Jeremy in this program sometime tonight and ask him about this guy to sort of fill in some of the blanks based on whatever he can tell us. If I'm hoping that we're able to get Stephen Bassett back, of course, so he can share with us some of his take on how successful the event was in Washington. As you know, if you've read media coverage, some of this stuff was pretty snarky. It seemed like the hometown newspapers for all 6 of these former members of Congress took shots at him. Why are you putting your reputation on the line? They dug up all kinds of stuff, whatever dirt they could dig up in their hometown on these members of Congress. They kind of threw it out there to try to embarrass them. And it almost looked like an orchestrated campaign of some sort to discredit them, to discredit the topic. I know the Washington Post did its usual hatchet job in its coverage of the UFO Congress. I don't know if it was in a news article, it was a column and commentary. It's hard to tell them apart sometimes, but it was pretty harsh. Some of that coverage was pretty harsh. But it seemed to me that by the end, the coverage was pretty positive. And most shocking of all is the fact that the New York Times had a positive article about it, that it took the subject seriously. If you've read New York Times coverage over the years of the UFO issue, you know that how shocking that is, because that paper has been particularly hostile to UFOs in general, to ETs, to any kind of investigation, the suggestion that there really might be something going on. It's shocking to me in a sense that these major newspapers don't give it a fair shake, in this case being the exception. Washington Post, which has likewise been hostile to the UFO subject, is where I first read about these amazing encounters over the nuclear bases, which, you know what, you can say all you want, as Project Blue Book did, that the UFO question has nothing to do with national security. That's the excuse they gave when they shut down Project Blue Book in 1969. They said it has nothing to do with national security. But I'll tell you, when UFOs appear over nuclear missile bases and intrude on these bases and zip around, they appear, they disappear, they split into two, they merge together, and in some cases, rare cases, they interfere with the launch control codes of nuclear weapons. That clearly is a matter of national security. There are some in the UFO community who wish that perhaps the citizens' hearing had focused strictly on those kinds of questions instead of branching out to more exotic topics. For example, cattle mutilations or alien abductions, the suspicion that perhaps there is some sort of a treaty or agreement between our government and aliens. Now, I'm not saying that I believe or disbelieve any of that. I try to keep an open mind on all these subjects, but you know, it gets that if you're not used to it, as this panel of former Congress members were not, if you're not used to it, that's a steep learning curve to hit you with all at once. So, you know, there was some suggestion within the UFO community, and I use that term in sort of air quotation marks, that maybe they should have done a better job of vetting witnesses, that they should have eliminated some of the more exotic kinds of testimony that was delivered during the 5-day event there in Washington. But it's done now. I really am hoping that we can get Stephen Bassett on to give us his take on it. He had 6 strategic goals when he went into this. He wanted to undermine the White House statement of November 2011. You remember that statement regarding what the White House said was a complete absence of evidence for an extraterrestrial presence or the withholding of relevant information by the government. He wanted to prompt U.S. Congress to hold its first hearings on the subject since 1968. I do want to ask Stephen about that, because that's a pretty tall order, and we can get into why I feel that that's a long shot for Congress to put its reputation on the line to have hearings about this. Thirdly, he wanted to motivate the mainstream media to begin appropriate investigative coverage of the subject. I think he got a little bit of traction on that one. Fourthly, he wanted to inform the executive branch that it risks not being the first nation to disclose an ET presence. Probably got some traction with that. The idea has been floated out by Stephen Bassett before that perhaps the Chinese would be the first to go ahead and break this news. And how would the U.S. feel if it is exposed as telling lies to its public, if some other government, the Russian, the Chinese, or Brazilian, something like that, comes forward first? And then his 6th goal was to add a UN initiative to the advocacy matrix. We're going to take a break right now. And hopefully when we come back, Stephen Bassett, our technical problems will be resolved and Stephen Bassett can join us. Thanks. This is Coast to Coast AM. Stay with us, everyone. Man, you can't believe how much of a little adventure that last segment was on our side. We sort of had a technical problem about 20 minutes before we went on the air. The phone line went down, and then we got it up right before we went on the air, but I couldn't hear Stephen. I guess you listeners could hear both of us, but we couldn't hear each other, so it just didn't work. Hope I wasn't blabbering there too much. I kind of gave away all the stuff I was going to cover with him, but we have him back on the line. We think we have these issues resolved, and I'm going to ask Stephen to maybe hang around a little bit longer than we had planned so we can cover the issues, and then maybe you can ask him some questions as well. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp, in tonight for George Norrie. We're crossing our fingers that Stephen Bassett is going to say something that I can hear on this phone line. Stephen, are you there?
Yes, George, I am.
Yay.
Hey, look, I solved the problem. You know what it was? I hadn't paid my dues this month to the NSA's approved Truth Advocates list, activist list, and so I PayPal'd them $50. We're good now.
Okay. All right, I appreciate that. Let's just give me your general impressions. How did it go? What do you think?
Well, you read the six, or you covered the 6 fundamental strategies, and all of those were advanced during those 5 days, so we're extremely pleased. The media coverage was significantly impacted by the tragic events in Boston, which happened at just the right point in which the media would have normally been looking to decide about coming down and covering us. This happens. This way it goes. Terrible for the people in Boston. Nevertheless, we got a lot of coverage. But it's only just beginning. See, the nature of this event was structured to not come and go. Your typical 2-hour press conference. If they don't show, that's it. If they do show, they write an article and it's gone. When you hold something over 5 days, then some media show up on Monday, and then the ones that didn't show are wondering, well, we should be there too. And then they come on Tuesday, and then some others see that, and then they come on Wednesday. So that's why we hold it over 5 days. More importantly, we have a publicist, an independent publicist working out of Washington that knows everyone there, and she is going to be working continuously going forward to keep this in the news and to start getting this subject on major mainstream talk shows. So that's just the beginning. I mean, the webcast, a lot of people watch it from all over the world. They're still going to the archives and watching it there. And, of course, we have the full record of the 30 hours in high definition. So we can continue to put this material in front of the press over and over and over again. And that's just the beginning. The event achieved what it was intended to do initially, but this is only the beginning, George.
Well, let's talk about media coverage, for example. I mentioned during my long soliloquy there that some of the coverage was particularly snarky, aimed at trying to embarrass the members of your panel, at least in the beginning. You expected that, right?
Well, there was some of the early coverage of the committee members I thought was poor, but that got better, and they've gotten some fine coverage. They've also done quite a few interviews, and those have gone well. One of the great successes, I think, and I think a milestone in a way, was that the New York Daily News, which is sort of a hybrid between a tabloid and a regular paper, which is very common in the UK. There are a lot of papers like this. They sent a reporter down first day, and he did one of the worst pieces I've ever seen. It was just god-awful. By the end of the week, the New York Daily News had gotten so much grief from so many people, and they sent the reporter back who did a straight and a good piece. To me, that was a milestone. Then the New York Times showed up. So the idea of the event, aside from the 6 fundamental strategies, which you mentioned, and mentioned well, I should say, is that we wanted to create something big enough, broad enough, deep enough that we would hit what we'll call critical mass and trigger a chain reaction. That's that simple. If you don't have enough bricks of uranium stacked in a pile, you don't get a reaction. And we will stack a lot of bricks there. And so that chain reaction could trigger any number of things. It could trigger congressional hearings. I think the members of Congress are probably, if they were reluctant to come down there in person, but then they could have watched it in the privacy of their home on the webcast, or any of their staff could. So they're aware of it. I've gotten one call from somebody that says, yeah, it's kind of the buzz talk around the back rooms. They saw how well it went. They saw how these Congress men and women and one senator conducted themselves. They saw that overall they got some pretty good, I think, press on it. And they didn't all, dry up and blow away. And they may be thinking, if they're getting that kind of response, what would it be if we brought a couple of hundred witnesses up here and held hearings for weeks and started digging into the truth of this issue? Maybe our approval rating would go from 10% to 40%. So that, I think, was a potential trigger that can come out of this. The other, of course, would be the media. And any couple of papers that decides to go Watergate on this and start digging and asking questions of the right people, they could blow the truth embargo out of the water in a few weeks, frankly, or a few months.
Well, I mentioned, for example, the nasty stuff that was in the Washington Post early in your proceedings there.
Yeah.
And Washington Post is where I read about those overflights at the nuke bases years ago. And they printed the story once, and then they dropped it. And then, of course, the New York Times, that was the biggest surprise of all. That coverage was fairly positive.
The new testimony is probably the most important in the entire hearing. The fact that it's not a major story, that all these people are being interviewed by every paper in the country is, of course, perfect representation of the truth embargo. A lot of people don't know that event was actually written up when it happened in the Minot paper. In other words, it was in the paper. They talked about it. So here you have a paper. It's local that covers the shutting down of nukes, and that doesn't go national, AP, full bore. No. Of course, that was 67. Truth embargo was intensely being covered, engaged in. So, there's been a truth embargo. They've contained this issue for national security reasons. We understand that. The evidence for that is overwhelming. But now it's 22 years after the Cold War, and we would like to get on with civilization. Thank you very much.
Some of the criticism, you had to expect this from within the UFO community. And again, I'm using air quotation marks around that because, as you know, it's a fractious community. It's often at odds with itself. Robert Hastings, who you invited him to be a speaker, I think, at the hearing, had put out a paper saying that, you have a problem. You didn't vet your witnesses. You should have maybe focused on just the more credible guys, the military guys, and left some of the more exotic stuff out. Larry Lowe sent me a statement who said he writes about this stuff. He said, basically, you gave grist to the mill to people who want to make fun of it.
Well, I couldn't disagree more. I have a ton of responses from all over the world that have come in, and I can say that the responses to this event are the strongest I've ever seen to any event related to the subject matter, ever. Not simply mine, but other advocacy conferences and press conferences, what have you. Extraordinary response. Game breaker. Total change. The overall press, pretty good. And I don't like to use the word UFO anymore, George. UFO could be a frisbee, a flock of geese, could be a snowball. We're not in the UFO business. We're in the extraterrestrial presence business, which has been proven many times over. We brought 40 witnesses together. The overall consensus is that it was an extraordinarily strong group. The fact that some people can find fault with one or two, is that even possible to not have happen? So overall, the criticisms that have been brought to my attention are a tiny minority of the response to this issue. So I'm sorry we can't please everybody. But
let's back up on this now. It's extraterrestrial. I think there's a lot of evidence that it's some kind of alien intelligence, some other intelligence. What's the rock solid proof that it's extraterrestrial?
The collective evidence clearly points to this.
What evidence?
If you have a phenomena that can't be explained by human activity, you have craft traveling 10, 15,000 miles an hour in the 40s. You have beings that have been seen by a lot of people who do not look human. There's extraordinary technology. And so it didn't come from some people living in a basement in Schenectady. It didn't come from the inner earth. There's a remote possibility, and it's very small, that some of these beings may come from a, quote, other dimension or from other time, but it's a small possibility. The overwhelming likelihood, and it's compelling, is that they are coming from one of those now, 70 billion, 700 billion, I forget what the consensus is, potential life planets in our own galaxy alone. It wasn't that long ago you had scientists going around and saying, there's hardly any planets out there like Earth. We're very rare. What a bunch of nonsense. The number just grows and grows and grows. And so unless somebody can explain where these entities are coming from, I think they're extraterrestrial. And if they're from the future or from another dimension, I consider that a distinction without a difference. And so, when it comes time to speaking truth to power, George, you got to speak the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I actually wrote an open letter to Al Gore a while back. It's up, but you can find it up on the PRG website. And it was after he was doing his energy thing, his global warming thing, and talking about how we need to solve this problem by inflating our tires and things like that. And I was a little disturbed because Al Gore was the vice president during the Clinton administration when the Rockefeller Initiative went on for 3 years. He was fully aware of it. And there is technology within our military intelligence, black programs, that is almost certainly derived in some part from extraterrestrial technology, from crashed vehicles, and it's just not available to us. It's only available for weaponization. Meanwhile, we're facing all these problems. And so the message I was saying to Al, you really want to speak truth to power on the environment and how we can solve these problems. You got to speak the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and then leave your fate to history. And so somebody has got to come up and stand up and say, look, the emperor is in fact naked. He hasn't got any clothes on. Let me make another point. Ronald Reagan went to Berlin. He stood at a podium in front of the wall, and he said to Gorbachev, Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, a lot of people were very upset with that, even though it was absolutely the truth, that wall is an abomination and it had to come down, and it wasn't going to come down unless Gorbachev gave his approval to it. And they said, that was just too harsh. That was too straightforward. There's too much truth. President, why didn't you say something more equivocal, like equivocating, like, Mr. Gorbachev, I'd like to suggest to you the possibility that you might consider tearing down the wall? Tear down this wall. And so I consider one of the most important aspects of what PRG does is not to equivocate on this, to speak truth to power. Other people don't want that. They say, "Oh, you'll upset people. It'll hurt other projects. Don't bug the government. Don't hit them in the face like that." No.
Oh, okay. All right. You're preaching to the choir on this. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I mean, there is evidence of something, some other kind of intelligence. It's from somewhere else. I just meant that I think the evidence that being extraterrestrial is not as strong as you suggest. And I remember Jacques Vallée saying, look, it looks like these things can essentially bend space and time, so they could be extraterrestrial or interdimensional or both. They could be time travelers, all the above. We have a lot of information that they're from somewhere else and are alien to us. I think the evidence for them being extraterrestrial is something else. But, you're welcome to your opinion.
Delay is about 40 years behind the curve. George, are you aware that over 1 million written statements have been submitted to the contact researchers over the last 25 years, some individual accounting for their direct interaction with extraterrestrials?
Well, they're encountering with something alien. I don't, unless the aliens tell them, "Hey, we're from this planet," which does happen from time to time.
It does.
Yeah.
So you have 1 million written accounts that, of course, the media won't cover. We didn't include that in the citizen hearing because we didn't want to blow the minds of the political media in Washington. We just wanted to impress their minds, not blow them up. But it's 1 million accounts. A consistent bell curve of evidence and testimony, and in huge number of instances, the extraterrestrials tell them from another planet, right? And so, look, we can equivocate all day long. The point is that there's extraterrestrials engaging the planet. That's what I have to say because that is what I'm convinced is true. I'm not alone in that regard. I have no intention in equivocating on it, period. Others can do that. It's okay. Not everybody can stand up and say, "Oh, the emperor is naked." They can say, "Well, he might have some boxer shorts on or something. I can't quite see for sure." But somebody has got to stand up to the government and say, there is an extraterrestrial presence, and it's time that you told us about that. And
you think that there will be congressional hearings as an outgrowth of this?
Who knows? The Congress is going through a bad time. They've been somewhat ineffective for the last 25 years. Their approval rating has been as low as 10%, which I think the Politburo had a better approval rating. Right.
But, I mean, this helps that? You think hearings on UFOs would help that?
Well, here's the thing. The government, the military intelligence community pulled this issue out from under the president and the Congress a long time ago, meaning you don't have a need to know. And that includes the oversight committees of the House and Senate Intelligence, right? Forget about it. They don't tell them much of anything. And so they don't have access to information. They have to spend 80% of their job raising money to get elected again. The rest of the 20% they got to use to do it is a fairly difficult job, being a member of the House or being a member of the Senate. They don't have time to really delve into other issues. They have to narrow focus on a few things. And the fact is that I'm sure most of them simply don't know about this. And what we saw in Washington from April 29 to May 3 is that 6 members, pretty good people, well-respected in Congress, not stupid at all, who had 80 years of service in the House and the Senate between them, by the 3rd day, their hair was on fire. This was the first time they had ever seen, in a very personal way. Maybe they caught an Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, but this is the first time they'd had Air Force officers with national security clearances that worked on SAC bases saying a craft came down, hung over the gate, and turned off all the missiles. A craft that I can assure you didn't come from Peru or Poland or the inner Earth. And so when they started hearing this stuff, and by the end of the hearing, I mean, they wanted to do as much as they could within the constraints that they have, and they did a number of things. We can talk about that later. But that I believe that if the Congress, which is right now probably the least respected legislative body in the developed world. Maybe there's a less respected one in Somalia, but in the developed world, least respected body, were to say, why don't we at least allow 100 of the military agency political witnesses to come before us for, say, a week or 2 weeks of hearings, take the oath, and tell us what they know about events and evidence on this issue, and see what happens. And you know what would happen? Within 5 days, their hair would be on fire, and their approval rating would be gone. As they say on the music charts, straight up with a bullet, and they'd be going, "My God, I'm proud to be a member of Congress again." That's what's waiting for them. The president, if he were to work a deal with the military intelligence community and finally come to an understanding of what they want and what he needs, and get the disclosure deal done, will effectuate the most profound event in human history, and his party will an enormous prestige, and his nation will achieve an enormous prestige, which he could lose at any day to China, Russia, Brazil, pick a country. Right? These are the messages these entities need to hear. Look, I understand they're all dysfunctional and they're all upset, and they spend most of their time staring at their shoes while they kick every legislative issue and every can down the road. I get it. But history continues on in spite of that, and they're being left behind. And the country's being left behind because it's dysfunctional, it's not taking action. And the largest issue, the most important in history, is right under their nose. It's been shoved under their nose over and over again for 65 years. And for 44 of those years, they couldn't do anything because, unfortunately, they developed this problem where they had 50, 60, 80,000 nukes stockpiled and ready to launch against other nations, which would have destroyed civilization. Definitely not a good thing. I get it. So their hands were kind of tied. But that was over in 1991. What in the hell have they been doing since then?
Yeah, you have no argument here about Congress, that's for sure, and not among our listeners either, I would imagine. I want to ask you, we're going to go to a break here in about 30 seconds or so. I want to ask you about some of the testimony because clearly some of it was really dramatic and fresh and interesting. Colonel French, the story he told about Project Blue Book, the mystery man who appeared on videotape, the Chinese scientists, giving us and other from foreign nations, the guys who gave us testimony from around the world. I think that was a really surprise to your panel as well. And those guys, as I mentioned, it seems like they're converts. Those six, if you heard my little bit reading the press release that came out today, those six have sent this letter to President Obama and the head of the VA asking for these records, demanding the records.
Several things they did, but don't call them believers. They are intelligent people that are simply responding to a mass of evidence that any reasonable person would respond in the same way. And the only reason there aren't 100,000 political people like them is the government has spent billions of dollars since 1947 to contain this issue so that it would not be properly engaged as part of a government policy of truth embargo.
Well, I won't call them believers. I'll call them converts. How's that?
Fair enough.
How's that?
Close enough, but I wouldn't go further than that.
We're talking with Stephen Bassett from the Citizens Disclosure hearing and also Paradigm, and he's telling us the outcome of 5 days of hearings in Washington at the National Press Club. Pretty interesting stuff. Stephen has agreed to stick around for a while because of our technical glitches earlier, and we'll try to open up the phone lines with maybe your questions for him as well coming up in the next segment. Bob Dylan's birthday, 72 years old today. Happy birthday, Bob. We'll be back with more Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with Stephen Bassett of the Paradigm Research Group. He put together the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure. A lot of fallout from that. A lot of tentacles in the UFO community. A lot of talk. Will it lead to disclosure? Will it lead to congressional hearings? We'll ask some additional questions of Stephen, then open up the phone lines with your questions as well, coming up on Coast to Coast AM. Stephen, the big question, of course, is disclose what? What is it that you think they've got or someone's got that they could still disclose?
They've got 65 years of research, investigation. It'll take decades to get it all out. But disclosure, which is the goal of the advocacy movement, capital D, is actually very simple, George. It's the acknowledgement. It's the formal acknowledgement. That's all it is. It's not dumping all the files out on the White House lawn for us to go through, but it's just saying, hey, there's extraterrestrials here. Thank you so much. I'll catch you later. That's disclosure. That's
that would be enough. Huh? I mean, does it have to be the president? Who does it have to be?
If it's not from the head of state, it's not going to fly. I mean, some bird colonel in the Pentagon, I suppose, could give a press conference tomorrow. Of course, he'd be immediately fired and put in prison. But no, it has to come from the heads of state. That's what people expect. I mean, if there's extraterrestrials visiting us, they would expect the president to tell them, or the prime minister, or the king. Disclosure is the formal acknowledgement of the extraterrestrial presence by the world's governments through their heads of state. One nation will probably start. I would prefer to see a coalition of Russia, China, and the United States come forward together. Once that has happened, other nations will follow suit very quickly. That's what we're seeking. Now, what happens after that? Who knows? Maybe the government will hold on to the rest of the information for another 30 years. Maybe the people won't press them. I'm willing to bet it'll be a rather intense time, and the exchange of information will be significant.
Well, let's say Obama comes out in a week and announces extraterrestrials are real. Thank you. Good night. That's it. I mean, that would be the last thing that anyone would talk about in his presidency, and he would be pestered with questions for the rest of the time he's in office, don't you think?
Yeah, he would also go down in history as one of the most important leaders of all time.
What else would he get done? Anything else?
Well, hell, just that alone. That's all he'd need. I mean, they'll be writing about it for 1,000 years.
Let's say what if? What if China announces it? It still wouldn't count, would it, unless we acknowledge it?
Absolutely not. The United States no longer runs this world. The days of we say jump and the world says how high, that ship has sailed. Right? We're barely holding our own. We can't even fix our bridges. Right? We're massively in debt. If it wasn't for cheap Chinese underwear, we'd all have itch. I mean, let me tell you something, George. That time is gone. And so if the White House honestly thinks that all of these other nations are going to remain, absolutely quiet on this while we dither on it decade after decade, they are grotesquely mistaken. Any one of these nations has plenty of gun camera footage from their intercept planes to go in front of their people tomorrow and make a very clear case, and it's done. And if the People's Republic of China were to take that initial move, the geopolitical implications for the United States would be enormous. And so,
well, what would happen? Chinese announce extraterrestrials are real. What happens the day after that in the United States to our
other nations will start falling in line as quickly as possible, and the president of the United States would have to go into the East Room, go before the people, and say, I really didn't want to tell you because you don't have a need to know and you can't handle the truth. But the Chinese have basically let the cat out of the bag. So I guess we're going to have to tell you there's an extraterrestrial presence.
Or he doesn't say anything.
Say anything? Well, he'll have an army of reporters around the White House. It'll look worse than Lewinsky. He'll be talking about it. Look, George, this is the most important issue in the history of the human race. And the reason that a lot of people don't get that yet is because everybody who is under the age of 66 has lived every day of their life under a massive propaganda program called the Truth Embargo, designed to make institutions and people and colleges and the Congress and the press have an attitude of like, we don't really need to know about that, or there's nothing really going on, or I'd rather not talk about it. It's an extraordinary accomplishment on the part of this national security structure. I'll give them points for that. It's certainly more effective. It was more of an accomplishment than, say, the Catholic Church, rather heavy-handed approach to sort of suppress the reality of the solar system, which they've since apologized for.
Let me get your take, a quick take on a couple of the witnesses. The Colonel French, that was pretty dramatic stuff.
Look, his testimony was pretty significant, certainly because he was part of Blue Book. But there were some other testimonies there that were extraordinary for me, George. First of all, let me say why there was testimony there by anonymous, why there was a 15-minute clip of a gentleman on his deathbed. Did I think that somehow this was some sort of a smoking gun? No. And was it needed? Was it absolutely necessary? It was not. Take that out, you've still got an amazing 30 hours of testimony by some very strong witnesses. I included this testimony so that it would be representative of all of the people out there who have been involved in this issue, and there have been thousands, who worked in a good faith for their government, served, their careers, retired, signed non-disclosure oaths or had classification, statuses that didn't allow them to talk, in some cases to anybody, not even their children or their wives, and have either taken this to the grave or considered possibly coming forward as they near death. He is, for me, standing in for all of those who can't speak. And a perfect example of this is Milton Torres. Jeffrey Torres was one of the witnesses on the Paulides panel along with French. And the reason he was there is that Milton Torres his story was outed when the UK released another batch of files back in 2008. And one of those files was his case where, as a U.S. pilot assigned to Britain, he was asked by the Brits to go out and chase a bogey over the English Channel in a heavy fog. And he went up, and he's chasing this thing, and at some point he's ordered to shoot it down, which is an absolutely extraordinary thing. Think about it for a second. This pilot, Milton Torres, was asked to shoot down a bogey in a fog over the English Channel. Could have been an Air France plane, could have been Belgium, could have been whatever. They could have been shooting down a passenger plane, and yet he was ordered to shoot it down even though he didn't have visual contact. And he was also upset because the thing was the size of an aircraft carrier according to his radar. And he didn't like the idea of shooting at an aircraft carrier, particularly a flying one. But before he could actually shoot at it, it made some extraordinary maneuvers and flew it away at high speed, which brings up the simple point that the reason they asked him to shoot it down was they were pretty sure that Air France didn't have any passenger planes the size of aircraft carriers. And so he lands, and the next morning, who shows up? It's the standard deal. It's an intelligence officer, gives them the debriefing, tells them this didn't happen, you're never going to talk about it as long as you live to anybody, which he did. He came back, had a wonderful life, got a PhD, was a teacher at a university in engineering, never spoke to anybody until the Mirror, one of the papers in Britain, called him up and said, were you ordered to shoot down an aircraft carrier, flying aircraft carrier in 1957? And he started talking about it. But he was so emotional each time because he had to bottle it up all these years. He couldn't talk to his wife or any of his comrades who had since passed away, even his father. And so every time he talked about it, he'd break down. So his son Jeffrey would be with him. He came with him to the 2009 X conference when he testified, or rather gave a presentation then. And then he spoke at the press conference afterwards at the National Press Club. Once again, he became very emotional because he was finally able to talk truth to power. Well, guess what? I wanted him as a witness badly. But unfortunately, his health was bad then, and it only got worse over the intervening 4 years, including the necessity of a back operation. He reacted badly to the anesthesia, and as a result is completely immobile, unable to speak, maybe barely hear, in his bed at home. And so Jeffrey Torres came to speak for his father who couldn't speak. This is the kind of testimony that I consider relevant to the truth embargo. Extraterrestrials are here. We get that. What we don't get is the government policy that they continue to drive, that we are too stupid, can't handle the truth, we'll go crazy, or whatever, and they have to keep this from us and keep the technology from us and everything else from us because they know better. That policy has got to end. And you have people like Jeffrey Torres that are stepping in to speak for their father, just like, and this is another powerful moment, for the first time ever, on the Roswell panel, we had 7 witnesses on that panel, heavy emphasis on Roswell, which, by the way, was an extraterrestrial craft with bodies. Jesse Marcel Jr. was there to speak for his father. But next to him sat his son and daughter, Jesse Marcel III and Denise Marcel, to speak for him and for their grandfather. A wonderful family that have had excellent lives. Jesse served in the military several times, including in Iraq, where he got seriously injured. They've led fine lives. His father was a fine man, and all of them have been called liars by the United States Air Force over and over and over again, with stupid-ass explanations like crash test dummies and mogul balloons and whatever else they could come up with, because Roswell was always the major threat to the truth embargo. And so the whole family spoke on behalf not only of each other, but for their grandfather, Jesse Marcel Sr., who spoke truth to power, and I can assure you it wasn't easy for him.
One quick question, and then we'll take some calls. Sure. The mystery man, the anonymous guy, you believe him?
One of the reasons that he that I allowed it to go forward. You know, it's not easy to vet people that were in the CIA. The CIA generally doesn't give you their records when you call up and say, "Can I have the records of so-and-so?"
Right.
No.
I'm just asking, do you believe him?
The reason that he is there is because I had enough confidence to go forward. And one of the reasons I had confidence is because there were two people sitting right next to him. Linda Moulton Howe, who interviewed him for many hours back in 1999, and Richard Dolan, who interviewed him for 6 hours just recently. Both of them felt strongly that the key elements of his testimony was true. And on that basis, I allowed it to go forward.
All right, let's take a couple of calls. Mike in Dayton, Ohio on the wild card line. Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Hey, how you doing, gentlemen?
Okay, what's on your mind?
Well, by no means am I part of the, I guess, UFO community or alien community by any means. I'm an average Joe listening to the show, and it intrigues me. And my question is, you brought up the point out of millions of possible planets out there.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that nobody will accept the fact and the odds that there's something else out there is beyond me. And I guess my question is, why do you think they're not releasing this or acknowledging this? I mean, is it from a biblical standpoint, or are they afraid of the repercussions, with them telling this is going on, or what?
Well, look, I give 3-hour lectures on that subject, but let me just make a couple quick comments. First of all, 90% of the American people now believe there is sentient life in the universe somewhere. About 50% believe it's already visiting us now. So it's not the majority of people actually are already on board with this. And it's not millions of planets. There are billions and billions of potential Earths out there, according to the census that have been coming forward from the Kepler work and other programs, and that number's only going to get larger. And so the universe is filled with civilizations, and some of them are visiting us. As far as why they withheld it, the primary reason was the Cold War. The emergence of the ETs in 47 virtually coincided with the beginning of what could have been a hot war, a third nuclear war, which would have been the ball game. And some very sharp people that won World War II, I think a little cut above the kind of people we're seeing now running things, made the decision that until we understood more about what these ETs were about, what the technology they had in their possession could do, and what Stalin's plans were, they didn't want this out. I understand that. Unfortunately, the Cold War lasted 44 years, and by 1991, the whole truth embargo had become institutionalized. And so the deinstitutionalizing process has gone on now for 22 years. That is the short answer. Come to one of my presentations. I'll give you a 3-hour version.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the call. Maureen in Medford, Massachusetts. Good morning or good evening. I guess it's morning there. How you doing, Maureen? Hi.
How you doing? Thank you for the program. And I was wondering, was there any evidence physically by any of the people that were speaking with their evidence that they experienced physically? Or was there any physical evidence that I think there was a doctor that extracted actual pieces that were inserted?
There are all kinds of physical evidence associated with the ET issue. Metal analysis is extremely difficult and very expensive. There are some pieces, who knows where that's going to go.
Well,
photographs and videos are physical evidence. Trace cases, traces on the ground, physical evidence. Radar returns as physical evidence. So there's plenty of that, as well as massive number of sightings. But Alan Hynek said it very well, and that was 40 years ago when he was asked the question over, where's the evidence, Dr. Hynek? And he would say, where do you want me to back up the truck? Well, the only thing that's changed since then is the truck has gotten a lot bigger. And so there's more than enough evidence to prove the extraterrestrial presence.
I think Maureen's asking about the implant kind of things that Dr. Lear, yes. Dr. Roger Lear takes out.
Implants are also a form of physical evidence, and I did include that, even though contact was not part of this hearing. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to overheat the minds of the political media in Washington, D.C. This may be part of another citizen hearing in the future. We shall see. But implants are physical evidence, and that was included. And there have been many, many implants removed.
Dan in Montrose, New York. Hi, Dan.
Good evening. Thank you, George. Stephen Bassett, you're a hero of mine, and I have to agree with you and some other ufologists. I, too, believe that know that these ETs are extraterrestrial, not from another dimension or parallel universe or time travelers. But a number of years now, for the longest time, and just a few years ago, I did a study on the size of Antares and Betelgeuse, the two stars. It takes 175 years for a jet traveling 500 miles per hour to revolve around that star. Mm-hmm. But also, for the longest time, I've always held on that all the matter, elements, and energy and chemistry and physics on this planet is only 1%, if not a heck of a lot less than what's out in the universe. And a few years later, scientists, mainstream scientists, have said, and they question, can life evolve from a different chemical code? Scientists ponder if life elsewhere is based on another set of amino acids. I agree. They're finally saying what I've been saying. Secondly, to this, scientists have also been saying that the laws of physics may change across the universe, or would change across the universe. So I'm saying that they said, do the laws of physics change from one region of space to another? If that's the case, if the chemistry and physics is different throughout this galaxy, these ETs would be biologically and technologically different. So when we see them, what do? We pass judgment on them, that they're from another dimension or they're time travelers? Of course not. They're just displaying physics, chemistry, matter, elements, and biology that we Earth people do not have access to. And frankly, I hope Earth people never get to it, because they're more advanced than us. They know how to utilize it. We don't.
Yeah, look,
all right, Dan.
Simple.
Dan,
their
thank you.
Technology is better than ours. That's simple.
I'm sorry?
It's simple. 150 years ago, there were no cell phones. Now there are. 150 years from now, we'll probably have some kind of space drive that gets around the relativistic theory. There's nothing shocking about that. They have better physics than we do. They know more about physics. There's nothing. In fact, that would be extraordinarily odd if they didn't. Right? It would be like us going 200 years from now and having our technology remain exactly where it is. It's not going to happen. So they have better physics. That's why they can get from there to here. That's it. It's that simple.
And the technological changes and advances are exponential. They're not just incremental.
Now, George, one thing I want to make sure we get in here is that, the citizen hearing is just the beginning. There's a lot going on because the goal is to get disclosure this year. And let me quickly tell your listeners just some of what's happening. First of all, we are continuing to webcast, both in English and Spanish, the entire 30 hours. It's accessible at citizenhearing.org, citizenhearing.org. We're going to hopefully get up some archives of this in other languages in order to expand the availability to the world's people on this. And, of course, we're going to use this footage and try to work it into major media so that we can expand the audience for this material, as well as, put it into the news organizations. We'll continue to do that. The documentary that is being built around this is being filmed and hopefully will be available later this year. It is called Truth Embargo, and the initial website is up at trutsembargomovie.com, trutsembargomovie.com. And we will be doing some crowdfunding on that. Now, in addition to that, something very important happened in this hearing. In addition to the fact that the 6 committee members signed letters demanding that the medical records that have been classified for John Burroughs and Jim Penniston be released, which would be interesting, right? Which shows what good people they are. I mean, they did this totally on their own. They did something else. They issued a communique that was written up Thursday night after the international panel and then was signed on Friday. And so it is the Citizen Hearing Disclosure Washington Communique, May 3, 2013. And essentially what they did in this communique is empower.
We're talking with Stephen Bassett of the Paradigm Research Group, and he was cut off in mid-sentence there, so we're going to let him finish his thought, take one more call, and see what else is on your mind as well. Stay with us. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. I'm George Knapp in tonight for George Norrie. My guest is Stephen Bassett of the Paradigm Research Group. I wanted to give you a chance, Stephen, to finish your thought there. And also, the phone lines are full. If you want to stick around, we'll take some more calls.
Absolutely. I was trying to point out that something fairly important happened at this conference, hearing. As I indicated, the committee was extremely impressed with the testimony, and by day 2, they were already in a whole new frame of mind. Congresswoman Kilpatrick brought up the fact that this should have an international component. Senator Gravel picked up on that, and then we held a meeting in the afternoon in a side room after the international panels were done, which included all the representatives from South America, plus Dr. Sun Chi Lee of the People's Republic, etc. We had a quick meeting. The decision was made to issue a communique regarding the United Nations, which hasn't engaged this issue since 1978. And that's another interesting story. But the point is that the communique was written by Senator Gravel, and then I worked on it a little bit, and then Roscoe Bartlett, who has a degree in physics, I believe, PhD, worked on it, and it was then issued as the Washington Communique, May 3, 2013. And essentially, if you don't mind, I'll just read you the 3 key paragraphs.
Okay.
This is an important document, I believe. It says, whereas, given the unfolding scientific understanding of the number of potentially life-supporting planets within Earth's home galaxy, it would be the height of arrogance to assert that humans are the only sentient beings within that galaxy, whereas given the credible witnesses have brought forth overwhelming scientific evidence documenting the current presence of unidentified and unexplained aerial craft that many believe to reflect an extraterrestrial presence, and whereas given the enormous global implications, if these craft are indeed of extraterrestrial origin, such an issue is a matter for the General Assembly of the United Nations. Therefore, we, the undersigned, request the Citizen Hearing Foundation, which Paradigm Research Group set up a couple of months ago and is applying for 5013C nonprofit status, use its offices to organize interested parties and raise the funds necessary to pursue a global campaign to convince one or more nations to propose a resolution within the General Assembly calling for United Nations sponsorship of a world conference addressing the possible evidence for an extraterrestrial presence engaging the planet. And then it's signed by 4 of the committee members. 2 could not sign because they were in a quiet period following their retirement from the House of Representatives in January. But I think their sentiments are obvious. So essentially, this committee has empowered the Citizen Hearing Foundation, which can raise tax-deductible money from anywhere in the world, to raise that money, use some of the witnesses from some of these countries and others to approach their head of state, because it has to come through the head of state, to have a resolution submitted to the General Assembly. So we're going to try to bring the United Nations back into this issue after the failed attempt to get it involved in 1978 through Eric Gary, the Prime Minister of Grenada, who came up here at the behest of all people, Gordon Cooper, Dr. Alan Hynek, Dr. Jacques Vallée. There's a famous photograph of them, along with Kurt Waldheim, the Secretary General, and others, at that meeting in 78. Well, it didn't go anywhere because there was no way the U.S. was going to allow that. They did set up a commission, but the commission didn't do anything. By the way, one of the people at that meeting was none other than Lee Spiegel. And Lee Spiegel is now writing for the Huffington Post and did extensive writing of this citizen hearing all these years later. He has stuck around, and I recommend reading his column. And so the Citizen Hearing Foundation is going to use the funds it raised to not only hold additional citizen hearings on this issue, but also to get a UN process underway that will create additional pressure on the United States to decide what it's going to do.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you. Lee Spiegel writes some great stuff. Check him out in the Huffington Post. Back to the phone lines, east of the Rockies, Mark in Detroit. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Okay.
Just fine.
Good. I'm calling because I had an experience, and the light that hit me, I've told George Norrie this before, but I'm coming again because I constantly see this star that's constantly the one that hit me with the beam of light on this corner on Shane. And it hasn't hit me with the beam of light again, but once it hit me with the beam of light the first time, it read my mind. It told me 3 things that I was already thinking. And I was wondering, even though we have Carolyn Chief Kilpatrick that lives here, it's kind of ironic that she would be on that panel, but it's cool because maybe I'll be able to talk to her about this. I was wondering, is it possible that they are connecting with the people on the space the space center up in space, the
space station, ISS?
Space station, yes, and having contact with them and also giving them data to have on us down here, because I know for a fact with all these conferences and everything, it's real. It's so real. I would never, ever call this station to tell no fib or nothing like this. This happened to me. It came out the sky straight down just like it did in Bethlehem on that Temple of the Rock, the Dome of the Rock. it came down on me like that, but it came down from the Renaissance over by the river near Caesar's Palace, and I was on a street that was like maybe a quarter of a mile away, and it hit me with the beam of light, and I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't move. Right now, I still have, like, my muscles are still tense and sore because I constantly was trying to move in between this and trying to turn my head. I couldn't move, man. And so when I finally got and looked every which way and popped in and popped out of the beam of light that was on me exactly, and took my head to the sky and saw it, it took my breath away. And right then and there, my eyes was focused on the light, and everything was coming in to me clear, but I didn't know really what it was after I stopped hollering, because I constantly was hollering like, anybody see this? Anybody see this? And then it just took it and, like, told me, like, basically, like, calm down. And I was like, I know I'm not standing in the light. It said, yes, you are. I said, I know I'm not, in my mind, because I couldn't holler anymore. I couldn't say nothing. I know I ain't standing in the light. It said, yes, you are. I said, I know I ain't being illuminated. It said, yes, you are. I said, I know I ain't brilliant. It said, yes, you are. I took the beam of light off, flew back up into the sky just like it did right off the dome of the rock, sat there for a second, it then turned. The sky to the left, to the right of me opened up. The clouds parted like an elevator door, and it turned and went. It turned into a fireball and went into a circle, and went and turned another circle. The sky turned to blue, red, and fire-like color and daylight.
All right, Mark,
all over
we're going to let our guest Stephen react to that. I think his basic question was, that's a heck of a story, Mark, but his basic question was, are there experiences reported by the guys on the ISS?
I don't know. As I said before, I know most of the contact researchers. Over 1 million written accounts have been submitted to the contact researchers, which create a bell curve of evidence, of enormously connected evidence, which is extraordinary. It's one of my plans, if we get the funding, if we get the kind of support we need, is to hold a citizen hearing on contact. And if we do that, we'll bring in the top contact researchers in the world, and a dozen or 15 or 20 of the most eloquent and communicative contactees who have strong memories of their experiences, and have them testify to former members of Congress. That will be an interesting 3 or 4 days. So, look, let's be clear. At the center of all this is contact, and it is the fundamental exopolitical issue. I understand that completely. It is what this is all about in some degree or another, and that's going to have to come out. But it's not necessary to go there in order to get the government to change the policy of embargo. But I can assure you the fact this contact is going on is one of the reasons why people in government are not particularly desirous of having to come out and talk about it, because it's so hard. Well, you know, I'm so really sympathetic, I guess, with the people in government that don't want to do things because they're hard. If they don't, then quit, and we'll find somebody else to take their job who will do hard things, and they will address this issue, including the contact issue, which is tough. I get it. But I assure you, in the post-disclosure world, it will be front and center. And that's just the way that it is.
Well, if you have a hearing in Detroit, you might want to contact Mark. That's a pretty colorful account
Maybe
there.
Mark will be one of those witnesses, yes.
Mark, we appreciate you calling in. West of the Rockies, Ed in Washington. Hi, Ed. Ed's gone. We're going to Jerry in Kentucky. First-time caller. Hi, Jerry. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, hi, thank you. It's going to be hard to top Mark. Mr. Bassett, I have a question for you, please. You're trying to raise money to fund the hearing, I understand. Mm-hmm. Would it be possible in the future to produce most of the 30 hours into perhaps a 10 DVD set that could be purchased from you? Do you have any plans for that?
We are going to look at every possible way to develop the 30 hours of testimony. We'd like to see it on the cable channels. We'd like to see it on the networks, DVD sets. All of that is possible, and we will do that. Right now, there are fair use clips of some of this testimony spreading out over the internet, which is fine. There's been some misunderstanding on part of some people out there who thought that all of this was funded by a grant. It was not. We did not get the money through a grant. What we got was a film production deal, and what that means is that an investor put up the money to do a film that allowed us to do the hearing as well. and that money has to be paid back. And so we have to protect our proprietary interest in the overall footage, but we are going to develop it and make sure that it is going to be seen in strong venues around the world.
Jerry, thank you for the call. Wildcard line, Eli in New Jersey. Hi, Eli.
Hey there, guys. I could go on and on about my love for you both, but I'll skip it. Thanks. You're doing the right thing. I'll keep it short. 2 questions. 1, what do you have to say on political activism regarding this? And 2, do you have any comments on Greer's CE5 initiative? In other words, should we be taking to the streets and talking about this, and should we be taking to the skies and talking about this with our neighbors and cousins in the space?
Sure.
And thank you very much, and the best to you both.
Well, this advocacy movement is not one that lends itself to what we'll call standard political activist tools of marching in the street, million-person march in Washington, that kind of thing. It fundamentally operates in cyberspace, and that's fine, and that's where it works. We have plenty of tools available to us, and so we can put pressure on the government from many different directions. Obviously, the hearing was a physical event, and that's fine, and we can do more of that. So it is an activist movement without question, and there are a lot of activist things that people can do, and we encourage them to do that, and we're going to be offering them options. So, and that's what I am. I'm not a scientist. I'm a political activist. My job is to get a policy change in the government, and is to end the truth embargo. Right? My job is not per se to find out everything about every phenomena that ever happened, but rather to end that policy, which I believe opens the door for us as a civilization to learn the truth about a lot of things, and that will be a very interesting time. I look forward to it. As far as the CE5 initiatives, fundamentally, makes sense. I mean, if there's extraterrestrials here, which they are, they're known to be telepathic. The reports on that are in the hundreds of thousands. And so the idea that you go out and you make an effort to sort of call them in or say hello, that's kind of standard. No problem. Is it a good advocacy tool? I don't know. But it's people that are doing it, and they're trying to engage these entities. In other words, CE5 means they're actually going out to engage them. They're not just being engaged. And so it's a proactive thing. And I think the people that are proactive on this issue in that way, I think they're much more comfortable with this reality. It is still disturbing for a lot of people. I get that. But being proactive about it and maybe even trying to engage the issue like that, I think it makes people feel they're more in control. So I have no problem with it. And I think you're going to see a lot more CE5-type activities going on as in the coming months. And obviously, if we have disclosure, well, all bets are off then.
Try to go one more call before the end of the hour. Skype line, Rich in San Jose, California. Hi, Rich.
Yeah, hi. I have a question for Mr. Mr. Bassett.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Sorry about that. So you've been talking about our governments basically disclosing the alien presence. And I was curious what you think would happen if the aliens were to disclose their presence to us on their own initiative. If we watch Hollywood movies, they would just land on the White House front lawn. Or where do you think it would happen?
They could do it anytime they wanted to, and they haven't, fortunately. It would be very bad. Unlike a self-disclosure process coming from the heads of state to the people, with the amount of time to digest, understand, explore, listen, learn, this would be a shock to the system, a force majeure, meaning which disempowers the government, shatters the social contract, and scares the hell out of people. And so an alien-driven disclosure event where they park a bunch of ships. You remember the moment in Independence Day when the president, Bill Pullman, walks out on the portico and says, well, I guess the question about whether we're alone has been answered. That's not good. And it's notable they haven't done it, and they could have done it any time. But maybe they'll change their mind. All I know is I can't control what they do, but we can control what we do. And what we need to do is to end this truth embargo and announce to ourselves the presence of this extraterrestrials and start informing ourselves as much as possible about what we know. And then if formal contact or some sort of open contact were to take place a year, 2, 3 years later, obviously it would be far less of a shock to the global systems and social contracts than if we have a force majeure event tomorrow.
Why do you suppose they haven't done it, Stephen? You must have theorized about that at night. Why haven't they landed on the White House lawn? I mean, as Whitley Strieber once put it, They are the true architects of the secrecy. It starts with them.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that if anything, they're totally unsecret. I mean, take some night vision binoculars and just head west. I mean, you can't even look up in the sky without seeing something every night. They're actually, and they go back to the same fields every year to put crop circles down, with more and more people coming there to watch it happen. No, secrecy is not their game. But the best explanation I can give is that while their activities are clearly raising awareness around the world and driving a lot of the disclosure advocacy movement. I mean, like when the O'Hare sighting occurred, you don't think we didn't use that? I mean, they have a craft right over the airport. It's seen by a whole bunch of people and shoots up through the clouds. Of course, we jumped all over that. I think they're driving the self-disclosure process by their activities because in their worldview, it is our best advantage, and maybe in theirs, if we have self-disclosure first before any kind of open contact takes place. That's the best answer I can give you, George, but it's just a theory.
Yeah, I would say agriglyphs are really interesting, crop circles, but it's not quite the same as landing on the White House lawn, an unequivocal statement of some sort. But I think that's a pretty good theory. I think it's a pretty good theory.
Yeah. And let me tell you, crop circles is the number one thing that you could look at and say this is all going to work out pretty well. Because entities that would use that modality to sort of announce themselves, these beautiful artistic things in crops year after year, doesn't strike me as people that are ready to come down here and do that, go medieval on us.
We got about a minute left. Anything else you want to say to the audience about what you do next?
Look, right now, if we can get people around the world to line up behind the Citizen Hearing Foundation, which is a 501(c) nonprofit, so that we not only can move quickly to get some countries lined up to submit resolutions to the United Nations, which I can assure you the United States does not want to see happen, and also immediately plan and execute before the end of the year the next citizen hearing, we've got a decent chance to end this truth embargo this year. The only reason that hearing took place is because a gentleman by the name of Thomas Clearwater out of Canada gave us over $1 million in a production deal to be able to do what we did. Without that money, that hearing cost $600,000. Without that money, there's no hearing. You can't get the truth by just wishing for it. People have got to come together, and they've got to earn it, right? Help the people that are trying to get you the truth. Fund them. It wouldn't take a lot of money, probably less than the salary of the average second baseman in the major leagues, to get this advocacy going. So we set up a nonprofit foundation. If we get support for that foundation, and by the way, that's it. You can see the initial page at citizenhearing.org. Eventually it'll have its own website, citizenhearingfoundation.org. That's the number one thing people could do if they're looking to see disclosure this year.
Stephen Bassett, always good to have you on the program. Best of luck to you. This was a heck of a lot of work on your part. Citizens Hearing on Disclosure, as you mentioned, a lot of this stuff is online if people want to take a look at it. And I'm sure it'll be coming to a theater or to a DVD or player somewhere near all of us. Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
ELO takes us into the break with a beautiful tune written in 1975, Strange Magic. Coming up, we'll take more of your calls, whatever you want to talk about, and sometime in the next hour, try to get Jeremy Corbell, the guy who made that film of the Mystery Man that was unveiled in Washington. Stay with us, everyone. I'm George Knapp, in tonight for George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Thanks to Stephen Bassett for sticking with us this evening and answering all of your questions as well. I would have to tell you that I respect his positions. I do. I am a journalist in my line of work, my day job. I'm a right-to-know sort of a guy. I do believe that information and evidence has been withheld by the government over the years. Where it is now, I don't know. But if there is information being held, I would support the idea of disclosure. That said, I think if we wait for President Obama or whoever his successor is to come forward and make a statement about ETs being here among us or visiting us, we're going to be holding our breath a long time. I don't see that happening. I also sort of have my doubts that Congress would hold hearings on it. I would be in favor of both of those things happening. That would be cool. As a newsman, that would be a heck of a story to cover. It would be all the more satisfying because of the years that I've spent covering this topic. I just don't see it happening. However, you might disagree, and I want to hear your opinions about it. We'll go to the phone lines. We're also going to get a hold of Jeremy Corbell, the guy who made that film that was unveiled in Washington a couple of weeks ago. So much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm George Knapp in tonight for George Norrie. Back to the phones. The wild card line, Roy in Marion, North Carolina. Good morning, Roy.
Hello, George. It's strange that the reddest of the red states, Oklahoma, the climate change deniers, they get the worst effects of climate change and refuse to do much preparation. And another thing, all these phony Christians like Pat Robertson, John Hagin, all of them, they were real quick to blame 9/11 on New York sins, said God somehow made the planes that were made by men, piloted by the hand of man, flown into buildings made by man. They said that was an act of God. And they're real quiet now about these acts in nature that are practically decimated Oklahoma City more. The Moore is just a suburb of Oklahoma City. Maybe God and Mother Nature are ganging up on Oklahoma, Kansas, and all them. They've been shooting all these guns off. There was a time in Kentucky, they have a gun convention in the summer sometime. They shot off an unnatural amount of explosives and everything. Next morning, the low temperature was 90-some degrees. There was a red bubble traveled just east from them across the country with the prevailing winds. Might be wildfires out west spitting tornadoes onto Oklahoma.
I'll tell you what, Roy, I don't mean to cut you off, but we hear this discussion on so many different programs on television and radio that I don't really want to jump into it again. I just tell you this, I don't think God is responsible for sending tornadoes on purpose to Oklahoma or anywhere else, just as I don't think God was responsible for the Boston bombing and had something to do with gay rights in Massachusetts. I just, my idea of it, it doesn't work that way. So I do not wish ill on anybody who's befallen any of these kinds of disasters, and no matter what the cause is, nor do I believe that Obama used a weather machine to cause it. But I appreciate your call nonetheless. We have Jeremy Corbell, the filmmaker I told you about, on the phone. He's the guy that recorded the interview with the mystery man. Jeremy, good to have you on the program.
Hey, thanks, George. Thanks for having me on.
Tell us, how is it that you came to be the guy with the camera in this instance?
A very interesting set of events, I guess. I mean, I am interested in, extraordinary belief systems, extraordinary experiences. I'm actually doing a number of films on the subject. And a buddy of mine named Reuben Langdon, who runs a production company, approached me with the idea of making a film on what we're calling the truth embargo. And I was actually kind of hesitant at first to get involved with it because my plate's kind of full. But, it just kind of sounded really interesting. And our first kind of mission was to go to speak to this extraordinary individual with an extraordinary belief system and, some extraordinary claims. And, it was kind of like a mission impossible, and I couldn't turn it down. And, after going on that trip, I was completely hooked with the film because I realized it was raising a lot of questions. And, it kind of brought us to the point where we just had to continue.
So describe how it is that you, can you tell where this took place and what the circumstances were?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you the basics of it. There are privacy issues that are going on, and we have to be respectful of that. I'm actually surprised that Anonymous allowed us to, broadcast his actual face. At first he wanted to be blacked out even after his death because he is near to death. And I was kind of interested that he had a change of heart because he knew that this story was, as he said, was weighing on him so much. So the circumstances are that I was reading the history of this case as I was driving up through this remote area up towards I'll just say the Canadian border, lots of snow, the sky and the ground looked the same, it was all white. And I'm going through these notes, and I realize this guy's come out before. He came out in 1998 with Linda Moulton Howe, and I guess I read a 20-part, series and realized that we were kind of going on a mission, and why was it that this guy dropped off the radar before? And then that was an interesting story, You hear the guy was threatened. He really, really did not want to. He went dark after that. So this was a really amazing human story to me, that an individual on his deathbed, close to the end, beyond the twilight of his life, he's not doing well. So the whole thing is, what do you want to do in the last moments of your life? You want to pack into a remote hotel room with a bunch of strangers and tell them this extraordinary story because you need to get it fully off your chest? I mean, it was just wild.
Let me ask you this, Jeremy. Did you believe him? Did Richard Dolan believe him?
You know, that's the big question, you know, that everybody's asking. And I think Richard Dolan will need to answer, you know, in his own way and for himself. But I think I can kind of speak generally, which is that we would not have traveled out there if there wasn't a long history of credibility into this story. Now, I will tell you personally that I do believe the core of his story, but I'm not doing this because I believe the core of his story. I'm doing this because it is up to you. It is up to the listeners. It is up to every individual to, you know, vet and understand this story in its full and complete complexity, which is, you know, what we're hoping to do with the film is bring more to light. But, you know, the way that I see it is, you know, we're doing our job. We're bringing this story out. We're bringing credible historians and researchers to be involved with this story, and the fact that he is telling it and that it has kind of stood the test of time, I guess, in some people's minds, yeah, there's something there, whether we want to admit it or not.
Give me a thumbnail for the people who didn't hear the testimony. Give me a minute or 2 minutes of thumbnail, the story that he told.
Wow. I mean, it was just wild. I mean, you know, the basics or a few of the key points. You know, he described being part of Project Blue Book, but being part of the Project Blue Book that would receive transferred files, kind of some of the more difficult cases or the ones that couldn't be easily debunked. You know, and we all kind of know now that Project Blue Book was, you know, not set up to reveal anything. So I always heard that there were these, you know, separate files that were going around, separate, you know, organizations that were looking into this, and he claimed to be part of that. And, you know, then he continued, you know, saying that he was engaged with work with the CIA. And one of the most extraordinary parts of his story, which you can hear in the 17 minutes that we released, because, you know, we're kind of put more into the film Truth Embargo, but this 17 minutes we thought was critical. And the wildest part of his story, because I could just almost see it happening, you know, and from a film standpoint, it's just so interesting. This idea that President Eisenhower was told that he did not have the need to know what the black budget was being spent on. And you do not tell a five-star general he does not have a need to know. So he got pissed. And apparently, as the story goes, he was going to use the Army to invade Area 51. I mean, this is the way it was told to me. So this individual, Anonymous, was one of a couple that were tasked to go and find out precisely what the black budget was being spent on and what, in fact and indeed, was going on at Area 51. The interesting part of the story is that he didn't just visit Area 51. You know, we knew what was going on there. We know now what was going on there, we believe. You know, in 1958 when he went, you know. And he actually visited the legendary S4, you know, going back to the story you broke, George, with Bob Lazar. So his account of that, I mean, trust me, George, like I asked him every detail. What was the color of the walls? Was there any posters up? What did the pencils look like? What did the bathrooms look like? How about the stalls, the faucets, the sinks? What did you eat? How did you get your food? I asked him everything I could just so we could document it and have it as something to relay back when we hear other stories. So I found this personally so exciting and so fascinating because I've actually been researching that facility and that other story a lot too. So, you know, those are a few little snapshots, I guess you'd say.
How was the reaction at the hearing to that part of the film?
You know what? I guess I did not notice at the hearing the reaction. I mean, people watched it as part of the event, and you know, I think it was received well there. What was so interesting to me was the reaction afterwards. And the debate that this has sparked within the intelligence community and the UFO community. I mean, people are just, as you said one time in an article, sharpening their knives ready for dissection, which I think is the greatest thing in the world. I think that this is what we need to do. We have a duty, in a way, to look at things critically, but also have at least an open mind enough to accept them if they're real and if they're true.
One of the criticisms that's popped up is that the guy's got his clearances all wrong. I think he claimed he had a Q clearance at one point, and some of the military guys and CIA guys say, well, that proves he's not CIA because that's a Department of Energy clearance.
I have, I one time heard a guy that you know really well, Bob Lazar, say something to the effect that you can take actual events and dissect the smallest parts of them to make them seem untrue. And I would say if you look at the totality of what, we experienced in hearing his testimony, that little fact, that tiny piece in his elder age is not the most convincing argument that I could hear against Anonymous being truthful.
So it's sort of like attack one tree and miss the forest.
Right. I mean, look, there are so many elements to a story that corroborate or add up or, kind of compel the curiosity of people. And that's our problem. Okay, you've got one thing you're looking at and you're going to focus on it. Great. But we must weaponize our curiosity. We must move beyond the fear that these things could be true and be willing to acknowledge discoveries and look at them clearly. So that is great. I appreciate that. I am not standing on either side. I'm just a documentarian in a way. I'm making a film. But what I love is the way that people are passionately getting into this. So now look, it's out to you, world. You got 17 minutes of the footage. Go ahead. Tear it up. Look into it. Enlighten me. That's what we're trying to do.
Back to the idea that he was threatened. Okay, 1998, he comes out with something. Linda Howe does some interviews, puts it on the air. And then afterward, there is somebody comes forward and does what? Says what to him?
I mean, I'll just tell you what I heard, but it was actually on an old Coast to Coast show from 1998. I think Art Bell was hosting it, and essentially, I think Linda played some of the audio on that, and he said that he was approached, and if I'm getting my story straight, fundamentally, it was at a supermarket or something like that. There might have been two instances, but he was approached, and he was told with no uncertain terms that he must not talk to Linda Moulton Howe. And you know what? That's the way they've told me the story. That's what I heard, I think, on that radio interview in 1998. But essentially, the way it was conveyed to me was that his family, his children, his children's children were threatened. Initially, there was a phone call that he received, actually. And that said some very specific things that he was not allowed to talk about because they were still classified. There was a specific base that he was at that was still doing some very, very classified work, and they didn't want to draw attention to it. So he was told he cannot talk about that. So that was kind of like struck from the record. But then he was actually visited and said, that's it, no more. So when we got out there, I mean, the impression that I got, you've got this elderly guy, and he's just like you and me, but he's telling you a story that you're trying to wrap your head around. And ultimately, I'm looking at this guy, and I'm thinking, is this really what he wants to do with the last minutes of his life, with the last hours? I mean, in the whole scheme of his life, sit in a room and lie to a bunch of us and never have his face shown, which was his original intention. He wasn't seeking anything. And that, to me, is compelling. That leads you only to a few conclusions. And where I'm standing, I think there's something of value in this testimony. I think it needs to be taken seriously. We owe it to everybody to do that. And so that's what we're attempting to do with putting out these 17 minutes. We wanted to get this out and then develop it further in the documentary.
In addition to getting it out and letting the public tear into it, is there additional work being done on the ground behind the scenes to sort of verify bits and pieces of his life and his story?
Absolutely, George.
Well, that's encouraging. I want to ask you one other question. At least we're going to go to a break here in a couple of minutes. Yeah. Can you talk about the other project? I mean, the reason that I got to meet you, Jeremy, is because of another project that you're working on that sort of intersected with something that I've reported on in the past. Can you say anything about it?
Yeah, I sure can. I mean, essentially, I haven't said anything as I've gone through this because I want to really focus on the integrity of this project. But I think at this point, it's safe to say I'm working with a really talented producer named Michael Malis, who's done some great films, and him and I have partnered up. And over the last 2 years, I have been embedded with one of the most enigmatic characters in ufology. We know as somebody that is very controversial, but I've come to know very, well. And he's a good friend now, and he has one of the most compelling stories on the planet, and that guy is John Lear. And, hopefully if everything works out, I'll be able to tell this story. I mean, there's a lot of details, a lot of moving parts to this story. As you know, it is just wild. But I have been able to capture one of the most intimate and interesting portraits of an individual within this field, in a way that has not been done before. So I hope that I'll be able to get this out to people in the way that I want to. And, hey, like everything seems aligned. It's just a sensitive topic, and I need to make sure that we get there. But that's one of a few really interesting films that I'm in development with right now.
Well, the Lear Project, the Lear Project sounds really interesting. I hope you'll come back and talk to us when it's released. As for this 17 minutes that's released about Anonymous, where do people see it?
Okay, they can go very simply to truthembargomovie.com, and they can see the full 17 minutes there. And my producer on that, Ruben Langdon, who's just working super hard on all this, we're going to release little bits here and there, but essentially in the documentary we should have a much more in-depth look at this particular witness.
And will Linda and Rich Dolan be part of that project, or do you know?
Absolutely. Actually, the actual project itself, or the film itself, it's following 3 individuals who are kind of on a similar quest to unravel this truth. And, there's a journalist, a researcher, and an activist, and they all kind of put it on the line in a way to kind of look at these greatest secrets that we have going on. And the realization that we are not alone, that's only the beginning.
Jeremy Corbell, filmmaker, thanks very much for sharing your insight into this with us. I hope to have you back soon to talk about all of these other projects. Thanks for being here. All you folks who are hanging on the phone lines, we'll get back to the calls in just a moment. And Montrose, remember this band, hard rockin' band with a youngster named Sammy Hagar and lead vocals? This is called Rock Candy. This is Coast to Coast AM. We're doing some traveling ourselves via phone lines. The lines are pretty much full from all over this great country. And we'll get to as many of your calls as we can right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. I'm George Knapp in tonight for George Norrie. I want to mention about the Coast to Coast website. We put together, as Sean, the webmaster, and I put together a Knapp's News section with a couple of interesting stories, including one that I reported for KLAS TV here. You'll recall about 2 months ago, back at the end of March, Coast to Coast listeners were first to get this news when Bob Bigelow appeared on the show. And he made this dramatic announcement about a deal he had reached with NASA that sort of puts his company in the catbird seat in terms of future space development, the commercial development of space. And I reported that both on Coast to Coast and then later on television here, and sort of got a poo-poo reaction from national aerospace media who thought, well, look, it can't possibly be true because they didn't know about it. And if you saw the news this week, Bob Bigelow, sitting with one of the administrators at NASA in Washington, made a formal announcement about this deal. It's not exclusive, but it sure does cast the space program in a new light. The idea that private industry would pick up a lot of the slack, that government would be a partner that would help them out. Maybe private industry, as Bigelow said, would concentrate on something like a moon base, which NASA says it doesn't want to do. And whereas NASA could put its limited resources into perhaps landing on an asteroid and one day going on to Mars. Pretty exciting stuff. Check out that story and the others that are there in the Knapp's News section on the Coast website when you get a chance. First-time caller, Kimo, on the big island of Hawaii. Aloha, Kimo.
Aloha.
What's on your mind?
I was listening to, I guess it was Steve Bassett earlier talking about the disclosure thing, and it just strikes me, I guess, and I agree with you, that it's really unlikely that the people who have the coolest toys are just going to share them with us. That's kind of fundamentally unhuman to take your advantage and just give it to everybody else.
That's a great observation. I think there are also national security implications. If these toys, if these toys are as great as they think, Go ahead.
With cosmic weapons, we're not ready for that stuff. I mean, I hate to be on the same side as the government, but I really don't think that it would be very special to hike up Mount Everest if there was a flying car already sitting there with people just hanging out, partying.
Well, it's also the national security implications. Would our government be willing to admit this stuff exists if they think that they have it and the other kids on the block, China, Russia, whatever, whomever, don't have it? And that I think is a legitimate concern, a reason why they might not do it. The other concern is, Chemo, is that, they have probably been lying to us for a long time. There was a congressional investigator who came out here years ago to look at Area 51, and he said if these stories are true, if they've spent millions of dollars over the years hiding evidence of this from not only the American public but from Congress, diverting this money from legitimate national security programs, then not only is this going to be a big scandal, but some of these people could go to jail. So maybe that's an additional reason. I, as I mentioned, I'm a First Amendment guy, public right to know guy. I believe in that and would like to see some sort of disclosure. I'm just not holding my breath, and I guess you aren't either.
Well, politicians they worked hard to get to a point where they feel like they're in power and they're in the highest position. They don't want to even acknowledge that there's other planets of more intelligent things out there, because that makes them look smaller and weaker, and they're not that kind of person. They're type A personalities that want to be in the spotlight and, the hottest thing in the world. They don't want to even acknowledge that there's something way far beyond their wildest imagination going on.
True, and even as Stephen Bassett acknowledges, information is power, and once you've got it, you may not want to share it. I agree with you. I wish it weren't that way, but I have to agree with you. Thanks for the call, Chemo. Appreciate it. West of the Rockies, Charles in Echo Park, California. Hi, Charles.
How are you doing this morning, George?
Okay.
Okay. First, I want to compliment your screener. Very personable, very nice individual. And I want to compliment you. You've always kept Coast to Coast on the same path and agenda as its creator, Art Bell, and I'm very impressed with that. I want to make two statements. One is going to be very, very chilling in regards to the UFO phenomenon that no one else has ever discussed on radio or television or at any of these UFO seminars or at the hearing. But before I get to that, I have a gift for these people that are in Tornado Alley, Granbury, Texas, West Texas, and in Moore, Oklahoma. And those in the Gulf states and those along the East Coast of the United States, because they're talking about we're going to have the worst hurricane season in history. George, you remember during World War II when the United States was protecting its ports and its harbors, they had created thousands of these huge metal buoy bells that were chained together across these harbors to prevent submarines from coming into the United States harbors. Well, after the war, they piled all these tens of thousands of huge steel floating containers at all these ports and naval bases. Nobody has used them in the last 3 or 4 decades. You can purchase them for pennies on the dollars, and they can get these units, take them to these cities where these tornadoes are just ripping these houses apart, and place them inside of the homes or next to the homes. They're steel. They cannot be destroyed like these wooden buildings or these brick buildings, and it would save the lives of people. And I'm asking that all the coast listeners get involved in that and initiate some type of movement to get those units into those areas. The scenario that I'm going to talk to you about now.
Well, hold on a second. I want to say that's an interesting idea. I wish I were an engineer and I could do the math in my head and figure out whether a tornado going at 200, 250 miles an hour winds, whether they would be able to pick this stuff up, even though it's made of steel, and toss it around. But I give you the benefit of the doubt that maybe it might work. I hope somebody else out there has some input about that. Now, what else is on your mind?
Okay, and Georgia would work because all you would have to do was to you steel and concrete on the bottom, and
anchor it.
You anchor it, and and not only that, it would float in floods, but men, women, and children and their pets would be saved, and no more would die. But this situation that I'm going to tell you now, this is the reason why the United States government has not disseminated the information in the UFO phenomenon. I'm 67 years old, Vietnam-era vet with a secret clearance in the field of crypto, also with a red file on me in the U.S. government because of my contacts that I've had since I was a child. When Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, a situation occurred at an American Air Force base in the United States where 3 huge cigar-shaped ships appeared over the Air Force base. These cigar-shaped ships were over a mile in length. One of them landed on the airport landing strip area. When it touched the ground, it created an earthquake like about a 3.5 to 4.0. It terrified everybody in the area. The back of this craft opened up, and several hundred young men with huge, heavy weapons came out of 2 sides of the ship and formed a protection line around the ship. And the people at that Air Force base, the commander, had a meeting with the individuals that were aboard this ship, and this particular race that landed those ships and that are seen in these huge cigar-shaped ships, they are a black race. They look like African Americans. They were about 6'4", 6'5", these tight-fitting black leather outfits on, and the weapons that they came out of the ships with, they were huge weapons. And if you've ever seen a race of people that were conquerors, that had never been conquered, they've got this look about them of arrogance. That's exactly what these extraterrestrials had, and they informed these people at this American Air Force base that not only were they from a militaristic society, but they had controlled a large portion of the galaxy that we live in. And this was the statement that Ronald Reagan was making to the United Nations when he said that if all the countries on the planet realized that there was a threat from outer space and from an alien civilization, we would all come together, but he was not allowed to make this statement. What I tell you is true, and the gentleman that you had on before, tell him to look up this information because it's the best-kept secret on the planet.
Okay, Charles, can you tell us how it is that you know this?
I was there.
You saw this stuff?
I was there.
You said you had a crypto clearance. Is that because of the contacts you've had, or were you a military guy?
I was a military guy with a crypto clearance. And, oh, by the way, don't let them fool you about the Q clearance. It has nothing to do with the Energy Department. The Q clearance is one of the highest clearance that an individual can get as a citizen. But my family is a very psychic family. And individuals like myself and others that have had contact since we were children, the United States government has what they refer to as red files on this. And when I was in the military, George, in Korea, I was contacted by a lieutenant colonel who brought me my red file and told me, Suleiman, there are those in the U.S. government that would like to see you dead, and there are those of us that are keeping you alive. And he went through my life from a child up until the time that I was in the military in regards to the context that I had, what was said, what was done. They know more about what's going on than you realize. And the gentleman that you had on the air, tell him to look at the contacts that have come from the constellation Perseus.
All right, Charles, thank you for the call. I appreciate it. We're going to move on. East of the Rockies, Barry, I'm moving on because I think that caller has been a frequent caller before. Suleiman, yeah, I think he's been a caller before. So the very colorful story, though. I'd like to believe that's true. I don't know how we could confirm it, but it's interesting. East of the Rockies, Barry in South Carolina. Good morning, Barry.
Go, Johnny B. Wells. Last time we talked, I talked about your great music and how you play it. Well, that Montrose a minute ago was great.
Yeah, Johnny B. Wells is, I think he might be on tomorrow night, but tonight it's George Knapp in for George Norrie. But glad you're calling anyway.
Sorry. Yes, I'm so sorry. You're exactly right, George. But listen, the reason I'm calling, I just saw you on TV yesterday afternoon. I was watching the History Channel, and they had that conspiracy show on there from 9 or 10 years ago, and it was when Bob Lazier came forward and was on your show there in Vegas in 1989.
Yes, I haven't done one of those shows in a while, but so it must be a long time ago. I might have had sort of darker hair than I do now.
Well, anyway, you look great, and you do a super job, buddy. I really mean it. But listen, here's my question for you. Do you believe Bob Lazar and his story and so forth and his facts and whatever, or do you believe the debunkers that say Bob Lazar is making this stuff up?
Well, it's not a yes or no question or black or white. It's a gray area. I'll try to do my best and answer it in a minute or two. I was in communication, email, and back and forth with Bob today. Next year will be the 25th anniversary since he came forward with those revelations. If I did not believe him, if I thought it was a bunch of baloney, I would not still be working on this. Over the years, we've had more than 24 people who've come forward with bits and pieces of information that support his story. People who worked at Area 51 at Nellis Air Force Base, who have seen craft as he described in various capacities. They've worked at the base in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and have come forward, most of them requesting anonymity. But some of these people are in pretty prominent positions still in Nevada, some of them government folks. And I believe them. There are reasons I believe Bob. And he and I have had this discussion whether or not the story that he told is literally true, that perhaps it was information that was given to him to run up the flagpole, gauge public reaction, see what happens, and then discredit the guy. A lot of folks believe that is the scenario, or a lot of others believe that Bob was part of it. I do not believe Bob is part of it. I've known him a long time. I've investigated him for a long time. I know that there are gaps in his story. I know those gaps exist because we reported him in the very first report that aired on television here, problems that we had in documenting his background. It's not like somebody else came forward a year later and had an aha moment. He didn't go to this school or he didn't work here. That stuff was reported in the very first story. There were circumstances that are hard to describe, but during that period of time, some really weird stuff went down for Bob, for me, for other people who were around him. Things that I saw, events that happened that make it really hard to dismiss. And finally, there were things that Bob knew about the base, about the existence of a place called S4, about the agency, which I had never heard of before, the agency that did background reports for people that worked at Area 51 and on the Nellis Range and the Nevada test site. He knew the name of the agent who was doing background checks. And most importantly, he knew when these saucer tests were taking place, because he took people out 3 weeks in a row and documented it. The witnesses, I've talked to all of them. They saw it. It rose from above the mountains at Papoose Lake, where he said it would. It was a big, glowing, disc-shaped object. The third time that they saw it, they recorded it on video. It's pretty hard to explain that stuff away. And yet, he's got a lot of critics. I understand why he's got critics, why people don't want to believe it. But you have to confront the full picture, not just part of the picture, when you're evaluating that story. As I mentioned, next year is the 25th anniversary of Lazar's coming forward. I'm trying to talk him into doing a sort of an update, maybe even joining us here on Coast to Coast AM. That is a work in progress. But, Barry, I appreciate the call. Try to get one more in here. We might have to go to a break before we get to this one call, but at the top of our wild card list is Paul in Carmichael, California. Paul, if we have to cut you off, I'll hold you off till after the break, okay?
Okay, or you can go to the break and I'll wait.
Well, you can start. What's on your mind?
Well, the idea you were just sort of saying a little bit here about the running things up the flagpole. What if just this is all just the war of the worlds and get everybody all riled up for something that you could just take over the world by, hey, look, it's the landing of aliens. We're conquered. Everybody joined together, and we're everybody heroes together. And our monetary system collapses, and we all join forces, and we're all taking each other out because we've got to have those guns. Where does that leave us? But it's not bringing us together, but dividing us to conquer us. Does it matter if there are people in space? I mean, do they really care about us?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it's hard to say for sure if they're from outer space or whether they live here among us, whether we are the aliens, we're the newcomers. Maybe they've been here a lot longer than us and they can intervene in our lives, but we don't see them. I mean, the fact is we really don't know. There are some cases, Stephen Bassett, who was our guest earlier, he thinks they're ETs, and maybe they are. Because some of them have claimed to be ETs. They said they were from Venus. They said they were from Mars, those early contactee cases. And then it changed over the years. They were from further and further out. They were from Betelgeuse or Alpha Centauri or some other stars. They would always change their stories. Maybe it's a lot of them from different places. I don't know. Or maybe they're playing mind games. I think when you talk about disclosure, there could be all sorts of crazy stuff that could happen that we have not foreseen. I hope I've answered your question a little bit. We'll get back to this after the break. Rolling Stones taking us into the break. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp in tonight for George Norrie. Phone lines are full. We've got our final hour here, and we're going to make the most of it. So stay with us, everyone. Much more to come on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Tyler in Lafayette, Louisiana. Been holding a long time. Tyler, thanks for hanging in there. And what's on your mind?
Two things. I had one question about the truth that's going on in Denver, Colorado's airport. Is it something that is protecting supernatural or just the super rich? I'm retired military with a superset clearance, and I was not allowed within 100 yards from a certain entrance.
Well, tell me that story. Now, who were you working for, and what were you doing there?
I was just flying in. I was working for an organization called Z, coming in from Dubai, and catching a little layover, and asked a few questions what was going on, and I noticed a lot of NWO plaques and certain symbols throughout the airport, and I noticed the more questions I asked, the more attention I drew to airport security and certain other security dressed in solid black, and basically I was detained until my plane left.
Did they identify themselves, the guys in black? Did they show you some identification?
Negative.
Who do you think they were?
I'm not sure. I learned sometimes you just don't ask. Go with the flow.
So was there one particular point that you were asking about, or a doorway or an entrance or something that seemed to get their attention the most?
Yes, it's on the east side of the airport. To my understanding, it has a pretty nice-sized basement that follows through to the tunnel. Guys talked about it over in Dubai. There's a whole city down there, and I just figured, I have the clearance. Why not ask?
Well, I like your style. I wish I could answer it. I don't know. I mean, I've heard the same stories and read the same stuff you have. I haven't done an investigation myself. I've been to the airport many times, and it's a heck of a facility. I try to keep an open mind about this, but I don't have enough evidence to have a strong feeling one way or another. But I appreciate you sharing that part of the story. What was your other point?
About plausible deniability and full disclosure. I think Barack Obama is in a position in this nation that no one would actually believe him with all the lies that he's already told.
You mean if he came forward and said something about...
Before Congress again and say, yes, there's UFOs. No one would believe her.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I think people would see it as sort of a diversionary tactic, even if he felt strongly about it. And to tell you the truth, I mean, I read a lot of stuff, and I know people who had talked to Bill Clinton over the years. We know that Ronald Reagan had an interest in it, in the subject. I don't know that
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter. I just don't know that Obama has been read into the program, or whether he knows, or whether he has any particular interest, or has asked any questions of his staff or military guys. But I think it'd create all kinds of political problems for him of a very real nature. It'd be hard for him to do anything else once he were to say something like that. And I think a lot of folks would think he's just saying it to distract attention from other problems he's got going on.
Like his first cousin, Putin, right?
I don't know, but his first cousin Putin?
Correct.
That you got me on that one. Are you saying that they are literally blood relatives?
Literally. I mean, I call it the disinformation and the low information citizens of America that don't even realize that the United States is an incorporation. It's not a country. And his mother was Russian.
Well, that's news to me. Tyler, tell me this. This Z group you're talking about, is that something you can tell us more about?
Sure. It's just it's contract work, previously known as Blackwater.
Oh. Are you still with them?